Hello and welcome to the third in the ECU series around recruitment. Today we're going to be looking at different assessment processes and interview practices. In particular, we're going to be looking at exploring the potential for bias in assessment methods and how to overcome this. Yesterday there was a lot of discussion around diversifying interview panels, so we're going to look at this. Also looking at different forms of bias that potentially are apparent in the interview process. We'll be looking at interview questions and decision making, and also finally be focusing a little bit on the tiebreaker scenario. The session is interactive. Tina and I will be guiding you through the presentation, but please do use the chat pane to discuss points as we're going along. We will also be posing some discussion areas as we go through, where delegates can share their experiences. In this vein, we're going to start with a poll to see what assessment methods people are using at the moment. So, could people click on the different assessment methods that you currently use in your selection processes? Just give people another 5 seconds to finish off your results. There's a few more results coming in. Okay. So we've got quite a high number of people who've used situational judgment tests and job sample tests. So that's really, really interesting, but quite lower numbers around psychometric tests and personality tests. So what Tinu's going to discuss now is how to, given these different tests that people are using, how to test whether those are having an adverse impact on particular groups and why this might be.
So one of the key issues around the use of psychometric tests, apart from whether they're good at predicting how someone will actually perform once they get into the job, is that we can find that there is a variation in the ways that different groups actually score on a particular test. And what is the sort of standard accepted criteria is that if you find for a particular group they score only 80% of what the group with the higher scores is actually scoring, then that is seen as an adverse impact. And that sort of test has been used in legal cases not only in the UK but also within the US. Now what I've done is I have put a slide in which gives the calculation. I'm not going to go through that now, but that should be pretty straightforward. I've seen on the chat that a number of people feel they haven't received the slides to the first seminar that we did before Christmas, so I will double check and make sure that everybody is getting the slides they need. But I just want to give you an example of the sort of thing that could lead to an adverse impact. This is actually an example of a question that was given to my daughter, who's actually currently applying for a midwifery course, and this was sent as part of an example questionnaire. For English, there were 20 questions. This was the first question. If you look at that word grounds, if you can quickly enter, what sort of associations does that have for you? Right, we've had a variety of replies. Some people that I've talked to actually take the word ground to mean the ground. So again, nothing to do with grass. Grounds is something which I think if you've spent many a weekend being dragged around National Trust properties with your parents, you might actually recognise what that word is referring to, or if you're a fan of Downton Abbey. But I think you'll probably agree with me that that sort of word is one that people with different cultures and class backgrounds might actually interpret from a variety of perspectives. And you can imagine how someone might feel if on the first question, which is usually meant to be the easy introduction question, on some sort of test, they actually realise that they don't understand or they don't get the words, how that would actually make them feel, and could actually then derail them from performing effectively on the rest of the test. So going back to our model, when we look at some of the individual differences that we get in assessment, obviously we've just talked about cultural and class differences, can lead to different response rates. And I think because ethnic minorities in particular may have quite a cynical view around what is the point of assessment tests, may feel that they are principally there to screen people out, may not feel that they are fair, or have had experiences that make them feel they're not fair. What can change that is designing tests that are, as far as possible, represent the skills that people know that they are going to do on the job. And when you do that, you can actually increase people's average scores by up to half a standard deviation, which is quite important. And so that's why things like situational judgment tests and work sample tests can be ones that people respond quite favourably to, because they see them as relevant and valid. When I was talking about the sort of reaction to perhaps getting that first question wrong or struggling with an item because it's not something that you're familiar with, the issue there is about raising stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, is where you are in a situation where you are having to perform, and that performance is important to you. The performance is fairly challenging, and you know that there are negative stereotypes out there about your group. You don't necessarily believe those stereotypes, but you have a concern that the people who are evaluating your performance, they might believe them. And so you feel anxious that if you don't perform as well as you would hope, then what you're doing is that you're confirming the stereotype about your group, which could then lead the people assessing you to even have a more negative judgment about yourself. Now, the tragedy of this is that anxiety, and I think many of us have had the experience of that sort of rabbit in the headlight feeling, ruminating and over-monitoring ourselves to check that we're not making a mistake, feeling embarrassment, shame, having hot flushes, all of these things that happen when you feel under the spotlight in that way. Unfortunately, all of those can actually affect your performance, so you don't perform as well. So what's absolutely key when using assessment tests is that we think very carefully about how we can design not only the content of the tests, but how we introduce those tests and how those tests are administered to make sure that we are not setting off stereotype threat. Now, the other side of stereotype threat, of course, is stereotype lift. So this is where groups who have a positive stereotype about performance in a particular area, when they encounter these sorts of things in the test, it actually helps them to perform better than their actual potential may be, because they're feeling confident, they feel that this is something that is easy for me to do and that people are expecting me to do well. And the example we have on the slide here is a study that was carried out looking at Asian women's performance in maths. So on one hand, Asians, there's a stereotype that they are good at maths, and when that stereotype is brought to people's fore of their attention, then average performance goes up. And on the other hand, as women, there is a stereotype that women do less well on maths. And when that stereotype is brought to people's attention, then in the study, the performance was below average. And so part of what we need to do is to recognize also that we can introduce our tests in a way that not only disadvantage women and minority groups, but also advantage majority groups. So what can we do to reduce bias on assessment? I'm going to hand back to Chris.
ECU has three key points about how to reduce bias in assessment. So the first is to make sure that tests seem as much like the real job as possible. So you can either do that through work sample tests, and we've included a link here to a site called Gap Jumpers. So either designing your own or using another company like Gap Jumpers. Now, applications within this form are given mini assignments that are designed to assess the applicant for the specific skill required to do the job. Around 60% of top talent identified through Gap Jumpers come from underrepresented groups. This gives the benefit and convenience of online tests, but avoids the issues from psychometric tests. A second point is to reduce stereotype threat. So that can either be through collecting biographical information once the tests are completed, and also actually through stressing that the tests have been shown to be fair to all groups. And the third is to analyze your tests, separate test items for any adverse impact. And if there is an adverse impact, then actually remove the scores from these items before calculating the pass rate. A few points here about the sound. Can people hear me loudly now, or should I speak louder? If you could just put a Y or an N on whether I should speak louder. Okay. So quite a few people yesterday in the session talked about diversifying interview panels. So many institutions have a policy regarding, for example, no male or no all-white panels, and they've used this approach to then facilitate the training of sort of BME volunteers to actually have a specific role to monitor and challenge unconscious bias on the panel. What we'd like to do is really open up a discussion now amongst you about what do you think the pros and the cons are of diversifying interview panels. Are there any ways that diversifying them can backfire? Or what are the positive benefits? So we'd like to give you just a couple of minutes to use the chat pane to highlight your thoughts from your experiences, and then we'll go through some recommendations from ECU.
Okay, so I think this is definitely one of these situations where there are a variety of different issues and influences, and I think it's about recognizing that we're going to need to understand what they are and to think about how we might be able to address and mitigate some of the cons and support the pros. So I think one of the really important points about having a diverse panel is the impact it will have on the applicant. And if you think, because, say, for example, a number of you have talked about engineering, that someone might enter the interview and experience stereotype threat, then having a diverse panel with female representation might actually help to mitigate that. If that wasn't possible, you may then want to think about what other things that you could put in place, for example, that might help to reduce stereotype threat. And I know, for example, one institution is actually trialing what is the impact of having pictures and short biographies of their various Athena Swan role models in the interviewing room on both the performance of the candidate and the selectors. The minority interviewer themselves can act as a counter-stereotypical exemplar. So one of the things that we talked about in the previous talk was that actually giving people examples of women who are successful in the particular role that is being applied for can act to actually help people manage and mitigate unconscious biases. We talked about how important it is that people know that they're going to be held accountable for their decisions, and potentially that might be the impact of having a minority member on the interview panel. Now obviously that is quite a challenging role for them, and I know that a number of you have talked about how important it is that the chair is going to manage that process well, but also that panelist actually has the confidence and the skills to be able to identify bias and then to be able to challenge them, and that is not going to have any sort of repercussions once they're back into work. If you feel that that role can be successfully carried out because you've got a range of perspectives on the panel, then it could actually mean that there is more challenging of bias that happens on the panel. There are more different perspectives and points of view putting forward, and so it could actually result in a more objective and less biased decision. So let's look at the cons. A number of you have mentioned a variety of things. One that comes out of the literature is that sometimes if people actually make a sort of what I call a diversity gesture, so just having that person on the board could allow people to say, okay, right, everything is going to be okay, and it actually means that they perhaps scrutinize their actual decision making and their actual behavior less closely, because they can almost take a back seat, and so this process of moral licensing can be a real problem, and I think will be exacerbated if the sort of minority panel member didn't feel able to really challenge and sort of was rubber stamping what was happening. Another effect which can be fairly controversial, and I think it's difficult to talk about, but when people are in a position, a token position, it can feel really quite threatening for a variety of reasons to do with people's identity to endorse someone from another minority group. And there can be a tendency to actually, if that person is going to be seen as representative of the group, that they have to reach even higher standards than the majority group candidates. And again, particularly in environments where women really, in order to survive, in order to succeed, really had to take on a sort of a more masculine approach to things, then they may not necessarily be leading to a diverse range of opinions and perspectives on that interview panel, and wouldn't necessarily mean that they're going to lead to more diverse hires. And then finally, we've talked about what a big ask it is for the minority challenger. And particularly, I think, dare I say it, within academic institutions, because again, what some of the research is suggesting is that the more meritocratic people believe they are, and actually the larger the cognitive ability they have, the bigger can be their bias blind spot, because people find it very difficult to believe that someone who is so competent could actually be subject to biases. That therefore can really make it difficult for the challenger to get other panel members to accept that despite being so capable, they can actually be biased. And then the other problem that arises is that there is a tendency, when people are challenging about discrimination they've seen against members of their own groups, people think that they are special pleading, and they take those challenges less credibly. They actually give more credibility to people who are not part of the group that is being discriminated against and doing the challenging. So it's not, so I think is this balance of pros and cons around diversifying interviewing panels. I think in terms of making the candidate feel relaxed and that they're going to be given a fair hearing, there is a lot to be said for it. But I think that in terms of training those individuals and training the chair of the panel to make sure that they're managing this interaction really positively is something that really needs to be given a focus. Okay, so moving on, I think we are moving on to Chris now.
So on that note about unconscious bias training, I'd just like to ask people in the room, so do you provide unconscious bias training for your interviewers? And the second question then is it mandatory? So just give people about 30 seconds to respond to that poll. It's just another 10 seconds as the results come in. So we've got about 80% of you, so like 4 out of 5, do provide unconscious bias training for your interviewers, and around about half make that training mandatory. So I think the unconscious bias training really responds to quite a lot of the points raised before and can mitigate some of the cons and some of the pros as well. But another thing that we wanted to highlight at this juncture is really to support buy-in to unconscious bias training and making it mandatory is the business case for equality. This has recently been a study which looked at whether firms that discriminated were actually more likely to go out of business. And this study was taken in New York before the 2008 crash. So the researcher wanted to look and explore discrimination within businesses, But rather than use a sort of a CV study approach, what this research did was they hired actors who were white, Hispanic, and black, all having sort of similar qualifications and similar experience within the story that they were telling within the research. And then they would apply and interview for particular jobs. Now, what they found was that Latinos and whites, their callback was 1.7 to 2 times the rate of equally qualified blacks. So there was an interesting finding there around this sort of potential biases within the organizations around recruitment and within the interviews. Now, what secondly was then interesting is because the research covered a large number of businesses, there was quite a high sample size. Obviously then in 2008 there was the post-crash, and so the researcher had this sort of data set relating to businesses before the crash, who would then, some of them would then have sort of closed during the crash itself. So what the researcher did was to look at the information, and he found that from the businesses that he'd identified as having sort of discriminatory practices within these callback approaches, 36% of those had actually failed, and they went out of business during the crash, and only 17% of those that had had non-discriminatory business practices had failed. So there was this interesting sort of statistic and research undertaken to show that perhaps firms that discriminate were more likely to go out of business. Now there were two, it wasn't a longitudinal study, so there were two perhaps competing theories about why this might have happened. So, for example, because they were displaying this discriminatory interview practices, then they might not have had the best candidates for the job, and so they were more likely to go out of business. And further, if there were unconscious bias practices being undertaken by staff involved in hiring, then it's likely that they were also doing that within sort of financial decision making and other decisions within the organization. So there were these two possible inferences from that research, which I think really do highlight quite a good piece of work around what the business case might mean and give some evidence behind that. Now, what Tina's now going to talk about, moving away slightly from unconscious biases, is around the double bind, where women and minorities talk about, mention leadership qualities, and whenever they do so, that they're penalised. She's going to look through some of the research relating to that.
My mic is now on. Yes, so most of you are doing unconscious bias training. So again, I just want to focus on an aspect I think that may not be covered in the general training, which is about the double bind. And what this is that where black and ethnic minority people and women, female candidates actually demonstrate leadership qualities in recruitment and promotion decisions, for example, rather than that actually being something that leads them to be selected, they're actually penalised. And this arises because gender stereotypes are not just descriptive, they are prescriptive. So they're not just describing what we think women are like, or black and ethnic minority people are like, they are describing what we should be like. So if we think of a stereotypical female characteristics, it's all about being warm and caring and collaborative and helpful. If we look at a stereotypical male characteristics, it's about being aggressive, ambitious, it's about taking control, it's about being self-confident. And then if we go and ask people, you know, what they think are the characteristics of a good leader, then we get this list. And I think you will see that there is a very strong correspondence between leader characteristics and the stereotypical male characteristics. And one of the reasons why the think leader, think male association is so strong is because of this. So essentially, women are meant to take care and men are meant to take charge. But if you think about what is required when you step into a leadership position, you need to act in ways that are strategic, assertive, visionary, decisive, and so on. But what happens is that when women do this, they pay a likability penalty because they are acting against the expectations of the stereotype of how women should be. So this is a quote: tough women are regarded as trouble, whereas tough men are regarded as promotion material. And women will be described as hard, BT1CHs, and so on and so on. More recently, there's been a lot in the press about the evaluation of women lecturers. I've just picked out this quote, which I think sums up the double bind perfectly, that if female lecturers are displaying warm and collaborative and inclusive behaviours, they're seen as easily shot down. But if they stand up for themselves, then they're considered bossy. And bossy is the other word, pejorative word, that's often used for women. So other examples of the double bind that are specifically around recruitment. Here we go. You're meant to sell yourself in an interview, but if you are too self-aggrandizing or self-promoting, then you're going to face a backlash. God forbid you talk about any of the struggles you may have had to get to where you got, because again, that will lead you to be penalized. And whatever you do, don't be too attractive, because attractive women are not taken seriously. Now, in terms of race, there's been some very interesting research on the intersectionality of race and gender that has been carried out by Dr. Robert Livingstone, and he actually looked at the male CEOs and actually looked at the way that they looked and their personas, and what he identified is that they all had what he termed teddy bear faces. So this is sort of warm, gentle-looking faces which would be non-threatening. And he talks about one example where one CEO even went so far as to get a pair of glasses that just had plain glass in the lenses, so that he could adopt a sort of a more nerdy look, which again is one that's not seen as threatening. He delved into gender, and again he found a difference. So black women were actually allowed to be feisty. That's an interesting word if you want to look it up. But they were only allowed to be strong in defence of an issue. If it was about standing up for themselves in terms of pay or promotion, that again would lead to a backlash. And in his research, white women just had to be nice regardless. So I think what this evidence is suggesting, right, it seemed to have lost sound. Right, so started just after feisty. So sorry, the network connection has gone on my computer. Can you hear me now? Right, okay, so what I was saying, I think I got to the point. So black CEOs have to have baby faces or be nerdy, otherwise they're seen as threatening. Black women get to be feisty, but as long as they're fighting for an issue, not about standing up for their own pay and promotion. And in his research, white women just have to be nice. So I think essentially what this sort of evidence is saying is that we really need to get to grips with not basing any of our decision making in interviews on things like liking and fit. Because particularly when it comes to management and leadership positions, what we need to accept is that for the minoritized individual, whether female or black and ethnic minority, who is demonstrating effective leadership qualities, we may actually find that they are making us uncomfortable because unconsciously this double bind is being triggered. And so one of the most important things to do is to remove that sort of discussion around likability and fit from our interviews. Right, back to Chris.
There's also research which finds that there's bias against parents. So parenthood results in lower ratings for both male and female applicants, as both are seen less committed and dependable, though for women only, they're seen as less hireable and promotable. There's also been some research around disability bias. So a study was done, and candidates who were found to be previously having examples of mental health issues, they were found that they were less likely to be recommended for hire than those with no impairment. However, there was no significant difference where they looked at candidates who had had a prior experience of cancer. Also, the researchers found that it is advantageous for individuals with physical disabilities to talk about their disability. Applicants who discussed this early in the interviews were perceived more favourably than those who discussed it near the end or did not discuss this at all. This result held true for applicants with visible physical disabilities, but also for those with non-visible physical disabilities.
Right, so the next thing is about obesity bias. In the UK, the CIPD has been looking with one of the sort of leading unconscious bias researchers at what the level of biases are. And what they're finding is that in terms of ranking levels of unconscious bias, actually bias against obese people is stronger than that against ethnic minority people and lesbian and gay people, for example. Roth, who we mentioned in the last talk, one of his CV studies that he did was to, in Europe, CVs are often accompanied by a photo. So what he did was that he photoshopped the photos and made them fatter and thinner. And what he found was that discrimination against women clicks in at BMI 30, whilst against men for BMI 38. It's so strong, actually, the research says it's best not to mention it. And what the issue seems to be is that people are making judgments about whether people should be in control of their condition or not. And that is actually what's leading to the bias. Now, the one ray of hope here is that, again, there was evidence that when people use structured interview approaches, then it actually lessened the rate of bias. The other one I really want to bring to people's attention is about extrovert bias, because I think that this is something that is really undermining objectivity in interviews. So the first impression, which is often based on the level of extroversion and verbal skill someone shows, has been shown to be so strong that it will even bias very well structured interviews. And not only does it affect the decision making, but that then carries on into people's later performance evaluations. So again, we're coming back to this whole question about the problem of likability, and using interviews as some sort of personality test will undermine all the efforts that you're putting in to be objective. And I think this is again really important because there's increasing research that is showing that this sort of association between extroverts and better performance can be really challenged. And just one study I put in here was looking at managers of teams where either the team was passive and essentially wanted to be told what to do versus teams where the members were more proactive. And the introverts actually made better managers when the team members were proactive because they were willing to listen and take on ideas, while the extroverted managers really wanted to be more at the center of the show. So again, there's a lot more we could go into that, but it is just to highlight just how important it is to not let this influence our decisions. Okay, so what are structured interviews? Back over to Chris.
So structured interviews, there's been some research recently released that shows that unstructured interviews are actually a poor predictor of future performance, with structured interviews being one of the most valid methods of selection. So in this research, there was sort of 51% of the variability in terms of future performance on the job could actually be predicted at interview. The highest sort of validity method were work sample tests at 54%. And if you combine both of these, so use a structured interview along with work sample test, this increased the validity, so the ability to predict future performance within the role, up to 63%. So structured interviews, there is research which is really promoting the use of these. Now, what would count as a structured interview? Well, a structured interview needs to be based on criteria that are relevant to the job. This can be undertaken through conducting, say, a job analysis of the current role. Second, to use a standard set of questions and a standard process. These questions should be designed to get evidence to display competencies around the role requirements. And then thirdly, to incorporate a structured use of data to evaluate the candidate. So all candidates should then be scored in a consistent and transparent way. Using this approach can really bring a structured interview which, as the researchers found, is a good predictor of future performance within the role. Now, in terms of developing interview questions, we've got three kind of key points we'd like to share with people here. So firstly, decide what sections of the person's spec are going to be tested at interview, looking at which criteria are going to be more important than others, and if there are some that are more important, then ensuring that those are going to be weighed appropriately, so including this weighting scale. For each section of the person's spec, create a question that will either seek evidence that the candidate has demonstrated this quality in the past, or that they may be able to deal with the situation in the future. Further, for each question, decide what a good answer would consist of and write each element down separately. Allocate a point to each individual factor that should be mentioned by the interviewee. During the interview, it is then a simple matter of ticking the element when a candidate provides evidence that they meet, and it means note-taking can be kept to a minimum. It's really important as well that each interviewer looks to tally up their score for the candidate before there are discussions amongst the panel.
Okay, I'm going to just dive in here just to highlight the difference between behavioural and situational based interview questions. I think they are essentially similar. The first thing is to really have identified what are the key behaviours behaviours, and what you're doing is asking the interviewee to tell you about an example where they have actually had to deal with the or demonstrate the action or behaviour that you're looking for. The question needs to ask them what they do, what was the outcome, but also to invite them to reflect on what they've learnt from the action and what they might do differently. Situational questions, on the other hand, are about what people would do. Now, again, although they're hypothetical questions, they shouldn't be based on something random. And actually, the recommendation is that they are based on what people who are currently in the job are actually doing. And similarly, those people are asked to help specify what would be a good example of doing the particular behaviour, what would be a mediocre and what would be a poor, and so that the interviewers have a very clear framework within which to allocate points depending on how comprehensive the applicant's answer is. Personally, I tend to prefer behavioural questions because it is based on what people have actually done, and I also think it's then very easy to turn them into situational questions if someone doesn't actually have that experience. So, for example, I could ask, can you tell me about a time that you had to deal with a challenging member of the public? And if for some reason they had it, I could then reframe that as, can you tell me how you would deal with a challenging member of the public? The sort of predictive validity of both types of question are very similar. So once you've got your questions and you have got your scores, again, there is a very sort of strict process that people can be encouraged to do. Firstly, each interviewer should, without talking to anybody, each interviewer is to add up their points for each candidate. Then all the points for each candidate are added together, again without discussion. Often the chair will have prepared a matrix, so it's very easy for them to enter people's different scores. If people have done other types of tests, again those scores are added in, and then all the scores are added up to find out who has the highest score. Daniel Kahneman, who was the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, which is really the Bible in terms of unconscious bias, says, and then you need to firmly resolve that you will hire the candidate whose final score is the highest, even if you think there is another one whom you like better. And I would point out this word like again that we are trying to avoid. What about the case when you have got similar scores? Over to Chris.
So for the final 10 minutes, we'd like to just look through and a discussion around the tiebreaker situation. So as people will be aware, there's a new positive action, relatively new positive action provision, which means that unlawful is not unlawful to choose a minority candidate who is of equal merit to another candidate where members of that minority group are underrepresented within that particular role. Now, some important points here I think to make is equal merit does not mean that they have to be exactly the same. You do need to be able to supply selectors with figures that demonstrate underrepresentation in a particular role, so you need to have gathered your evidence, and that this tiebreaker scenario applies to all the protected characteristics. We've included a link to the official government research there, guidance there. So out of interest amongst people here, have any of you formally made use of the tiebreaker provision, and have any of you informally made use of it? So, the vast majority of people haven't formally used the tiebreaker provision. and a smaller percentage, but still a majority, haven't informally made the use of it either. I think it'd be really helpful for everybody just to have a short discussion. What are people's reservations about using the tiebreaker provision?
Okay, so I think, as people have said, we are very much at the front of the sort of wave when it comes to this. I do have a couple of reflections. The first is, I think in the first seminar we talked about if diversity is going to have a job to do, and interestingly enough, that one of those jobs that was discussed was actually being the representative on diversifying panels, for example, then if that has been built into the person specification, it actually gives credit for that. But also, I just want to balance up the impact of unconscious bias on decisions around merit. And I've put together this little diagram showing on one side a sort of minority candidate who isn't benefiting from positive unconscious bias. They're essentially bringing their skills and knowledge, while on the other side, the candidate is possibly benefiting from a variety of different influences. So the first is the tendency for people to assume that men are more competent, the direction of the think leader, think male bias, the fact that individuals, because of past privilege, will have had the opportunity to develop a greater track record, because of greater opportunities to network through that greater track record more ability to get insider knowledge, the confidence and relaxation that comes with stereotype lift. All of that will be added on top of their skills and knowledge. So I would suggest that when you are in a situation where you have a minority candidate who has scored equally to a majority candidate, that evaluation of the scores is perhaps possibly an underestimation of their actual skills and potential, because it's almost like trying to make headway in a prevailing wind. They have had to push against all of the unconscious biases that are trying to undermine people's evaluation of their performance in order to reach that point. So again, I think it's something that we could have quite an interesting discussion about, but I just wanted to put that out there in front of you. Okay, so final words here, which is, in summary, what are some of the things that we could be doing to increase objectivity of decision making? Some institutions go so far as to treat the interview as just another information gathering exercise, and that the people who then make the final decision, looking at all the scores that people have obtained around their performance across a range of different assessments, are different from the people who actually make the decision. And so Google, for example, have a rule that managers cannot interview for their own team. Interesting, I think it would be quite challenging one for people to take on board. Really eliminate and ban any discussion of fit, because not only does it really trigger all of these affinity, leadership, agency, and other biases, if we've really got the business case for diversity, actually what we want to do is that we want to bring people in who are different, and so by definition they're not going to fit. Consider multiple mini interviewers, so each interviewer is only interviewing each candidate around a particular cluster in the person specification, and that can help to minimize things like halo effects and lead to more objectivity. Really consider the training for the chair. Again, their role in reminding panelists to be fair about the importance of following processes and keeping good notes, and also that they will be accountable for their decisions. And I think I should add into that then build in processes like, for example, spot observers or spot audits, so that over the course of a year any interview panel knows that they could be the one that is assessed. And then finally, that you insist that panelists stick to the structured processes that you have designed and put in place to help them being fair. Okay, so that's all that we're able to cover this afternoon. The slides we're going to send you immediately after the session. Unfortunately, it will take a bit longer to get the recordings and chat pane to you, but we will get those to you next week. I would be very interested in receiving any emails about any other topics, for example, that it would be helpful for us to plan to deliver next year. And so it's just for me to say goodbye, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your participation.